Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Hi, I'm Cindy Leines, host of the Northern Lights show today. I'm here with James Ogland, author of Picturing Lake Minnetonka. Hi, Jim, how are you?
I am great today.
What a beautiful day.
It is.
This is what your book talks about, is a picturesque day.
That's right.
So what ever gave you the idea to start Picturing Lake Minnetonka?
Well, I love Lake Minnetonka, and I've lived on or near the lake my entire life. And some number of years ago, I started collecting Minnetonka memorabilia. Postcards specifically. I have somewhat of a collection of over 300 postcards, and I decided that this would be good. A lot of people hadn't seen these before, and some of them never published, and so I thought it'd be a good way to let other people take a look at some of the cards that were pictured in the early days of Lake Minnetonka.
Well, and they say pictures are worth 1,000 words, right?
Well, it certainly is true here.
And in front of the Minnehaha restored steamboat's appropriate, because as I understand it, you have been very much a part of restoring the Minnehaha.
Yeah, I spent a lot of years here. The project actually was a 6-year project from 1990 to 1996. A lot of man hours, a lot of dollars. And since that time, and since it's been launched, I also have been part of the crew, captaining the boat from time to time. So it's been a really great experience.
Well, let's go sit down for a few minutes and hear some more about Picturing Lake Minnetonka with James Ogland. Your book, Picturing Lake Minnetonka, has the postcards and showcases, you get a nostalgic feeling, there's tradition here, and it's like you're going on an excursion. How did those postcards come, how did you gather all those postcards?
Well, I think you're right, there really does, postcards really do step you back in time, and I think that when you look at not only the images, but the written portion of the postcard, that it's doubly interesting, you know, to see what people have written in those early days. Well, I started collecting postcards real early on, but certainly the restoration of the Steamboat encouraged me to collect Lake Minnetonka memorabilia. And I really kind of zeroed in on postcards because they, at the time, this is several years ago now, were readily available. Mm-hmm. More so than they are now, but readily available in antique stores and personal collections and even garage sales from time to time.
Well, and in your book you talk about different kinds of photography that evolved. What were some of those photographic images, and how were they taken?
Well, that was the thing I think that encouraged me to write the book, was the fact that a lot of these postcards had never been published, and these wonderful images that the old photographers created. They were using very unwieldy, large, cumbersome equipment, and we really owe them a debt of gratitude, because they were taking 8x10 glass negative type of images and preserving those images, and then eventually when the postcard period came along, which was actually quite a few years later, a lot of these photographs were taken in the 1880s and 90s that weren't used as postcards until probably 1905, 1906. 1907 is when they really became a postal craze, not only Minnetonka, but across the United States and the world even. So,
and now we have the digital cameras, you know, that are this big, and
right.
and it's hard to imagine in the 1800s when they were carrying the big
heavy cameras. They had more than just a camera too. They almost had to carry a darkroom with them. They carried a tent. And a lot of the glass plate negatives had a gooey substance put on them, and that was light sensitive, and they had to be developed almost immediately. and preserved. So they really had a work cut out for them to drag all this equipment around, and we certainly are fortunate today.
Well, and you did a nice job in the book on taking you through the excursion of taking you from behind the scenes of taking an image and a photograph to now going to different places within Lake Minnetonka that were developing. Some of Big Island, for instance. What was going on at Big Island in your book? You show some of the...
Well, that was really a highlight of the early part of the century. You know, the early developer of the streetcar line that came eventually to Excelsior was an extension from Lake Calhoun and Lake Harriet, and it was through his mind that the developing a destination like Big Island Amusement Park and picnic grounds was certainly for the common people of the Twin Cities to be able to board a streetcar, come to the lake, take a ferry boat to Big Island, and enjoy a picnic there. And there was a roller coaster and other attractions as well. So it was a remarkable experience for a lot of people that were just finally able to get around. Automobiles weren't here yet, and so streetcars and streetcar boats such as these were really important to destination transportation.
And in your book, you have pictures that show what was on Big Island. What are some of the, let's talk about some of those pictures.
Well, Big Island was created in 1906, and it was really a very musically minded. They had a large music casino and very famous bands, including Tom Philip Sousa, came there along as other large well-known bands, local bands, as well as big bands from around the country. And so they had picnic grounds, of course, and picnic kitchens.
Ferris wheels?
They didn't have a Ferris wheel, but they had a roller coaster, and they had an aviary for a bird sanctuary, and they had rowboats that you could rent that was a very popular thing to take your best girl or your wife out for a ride in a rowboat. And there was some 60 rowboats available for rent once you got to Big Island. And Big Island, the music casinos were wonderful in that they had concerts in the streetcar boats. Even though that wasn't their mission, they fanned out across the lake and brought people to the concerts, and then after it was over, they'd take them back home again. So
what a delightful evening.
It was. It was a real, not only in the ride back to Minneapolis, St. Paul on the streetcars was an experience in itself. They ran those streetcars at sometimes 60 miles an hour, and they were on what was called the Great White Way. They lit it up profusely at night, so it was an experience just going back after dark.
Really? And what was generating? Was it coal at that point on the streetcars?
No, the streetcars were electric,
okay.
And they were connected to wires, overhead wires, and the rails, of course. Steamboats were all at that time coal, steam, and they were steam powered. And the Rapid Transit Company had some 14 steamboats in their operation that were either ferry boats, 3 ferry boats, and then the 7 streetcar boats, which were express boats, and then the excursion boats themselves, and a couple of tugs to help if there was trouble.
Well, in your boat, in your book, you show the difference between the excursion boats and the steamboats, and how they were shaped differently. And I know when you restored the Minnehaha, you were instrumental in making sure it was restored to fit the accurate shape.
Right. And we had discovered some plans that allowed us to rebuild it almost to exactly the way it had been. And even the engine and the boiler are reminiscent of the same vintage engines that were in these boats at the time. The ferry boats going to Big Island, on busy weekends, one left every 20 minutes, if you can imagine it. And oftentimes there was 15,000 people a day visited Big Island. And the ferry boats were 142 feet long, and they each carried 1,000 passengers. And they were double-ended, so they didn't have to turn around. They can just dock and then back out and go right across the lake again. So it was an incredible period particularly on weekends. You know, it was they ran less frequently during the week.
And where did they launch out of? Where did they?
They were all right here in Excelsior. Excelsior was home port for many of these boats, and most of the boats, all of the boats actually. They went to Wayzata and Mound and other points, but they were docked overnight. Home base, you might say, was right here, almost where we are now.
Okay, so if people want to come see the restored Minnehaha, they can actually come into Excelsior,
right,
and come down and see it. And does it travel? It's traveling now and doing cruises for people to come on board and experience what it was like.
It is.
At a time that your book was written.
And it's really like stepping back in time to step on the Minnehaha. It's a 70-foot boat, carries nowadays 90 passengers, and it essentially runs on weekends. It makes 4 trips on Saturday and Sunday, and it makes a round trip to Wayzata twice a day, and then shorter loop trips out of Excelsior. And it's nominally priced, and it's really I think an exciting experience that has. I think what the Minnehaha has done is it's rekindled interest too in our local history. It's brought out interest in postcards and the photography and some of the photos, and so it is a good experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have taken the Minnehaha and I've come down here with my family, and you're right, it's an experience that we wouldn't have otherwise. The richness of the wood that's been recreated, that you've restored, and having a sense of what it would be like to, if that was one of the few boats on the lake,
yeah,
and riding it across and going to Big Island.
It certainly is reliving that experience, I think, and we've tried to replicate that with even the uniforms of the crew, and they give fascinating talks along the way, so you learn something of the history of the lake and at these periods of time, and which makes it even more fascinating, I think.
We'll need to take a little tour after a bit here on the Minnehaha. So where did people stay? Did they come and go to any of the grand hotels of Lake Minnetonka?
Well, there was really 2 periods that are covered in the book. This early period, which is what's been called the glory years, and this is the years, basically the 1880s and 90s. And this is the period of the huge hotels, the Lafayette at Minnetonka Beach, the St. Louis Hotel at Deep Haven, and the Tonka Bay Hotel at Tonka Bay. And these people came from all over the United States and the world, in fact, and most of them, a great majority of them, came from the Deep South. They came essentially to escape the suffocating heat of the summer South, and they also came to get away from yellow fever. And but that period ended when the same railroads that had brought the wealthy tourists to Minnetonka from the south and the east, the same railroads are now taking them elsewhere. They took them to Yellowstone Park, to Glacier Park, and to Mackinac Island and seaside resorts of the East Coast. And so Minnetonka kind of slept for a few years until these boats. Thomas Lowry was the president and principal stockholder, and his vision had these boats and the amusement park in mind. And so it rekindled tourism and established Minnetonka as a destination site for some years after that.
And the grand hotels, you show them, I mean, they were truly grand.
They were.
In the grand scheme of everything, both in the exterior as well as on the interior.
Well, they were huge too, and the Lafayette, for example, was 5 stories high, almost 800 feet long, and could handle had 300 rooms, so it could handle lots of people.
Cool.
And it was a famous hotel that had presidents and generals and European visitors as well. And it was really built by James J. Hill. And James J. Hill, of course, was the railroad magnate that brought the Great Northern Railroad to the lake on that shore, and eventually to Mound, and built the Hotel Delatero as well in Spring Park. And that was another grand big hotel, but it was a little bit later than the others, 1885.
And how long was the Delatero around?
Now, the Delatero was around for a long time, way beyond all the others. It lasted almost 60 years. It was built in 1885, and it finally burned in July of 1945, as did most of the other hotels burned. They were wooden, of course, and lightning strikes and other electrical hazards, it was tragic that we don't have one left today.
It is, because they were grand.
They were a wonderful time, a wonderful period in time.
Which reminds me about, you talk in the book what happened to all the boats.
Right.
The Minnehaha has been restored, but it was restored from being taken out of the bottom of Lake Minnetonka, accurate?
Right. It was, when they lasted about 20 years, these express boats, or streetcar boats as they're called, and they carried passengers all over the lake. And finally, as ridership diminished, the Model T Ford was here. People were using other ways to get around the lake, and the practice at the time was to just sink them. So they took the Minnehaha, the White Bear, and the Como, and they filled them with water and stripped them of a lot of their equipment, took them out into deep water off Big Island, and there they lie for 54 years until this one was discovered by a diver, Jerry Provost, and brought to the surface, and spent 6 years in a restoration.
And what a treasure to be able to bring back in restoration. Now, what about the other boats?
The other boats are still there, and I don't think there's any plan to raise them. Of course, it'd be very expensive, but the state of Minnesota also has rules now that on what you can remove from the lake. And we have had underwater photography of a lot of these boats. They're still there, and they're just sitting there, and particularly the Hopkins, which was not sunk until 1948, so it had 20 years less time on the bottom than this one, and it's in really good shape, and it's just sitting there for divers to go down and have a look at.
It's amazing.
They've been pretty well identified now with latitude and longitude, and divers and others can find them, and there's other boats there as well.
Well, and I think about, in your book, you talk about the tons of coal that would be put into these every day, at the end of every day. So these were not light boats. To sink these had to be a difficult chore.
Well, they were heavy boats. This one was about 35 tons, and they did coal every day. The coal was right here in Excelsior. It came by train to a pit holding place where every night the boats would pull in, and they would put in 6 tons of coal. And
we're kind of weaklings now.
They really are.
We complain about a 5-gallon pail.
Yeah, that's right. They had their work cut out for them to wheelbarrow this coal down to the boats and put it into the hold. The coal actually served a double function. It was ballast as well as the material that fueled the boilers that created the steam. And so the coal was an important thing to them.
Which I suspect that also created a loss of a lot of jobs when those went out of business.
Well, I'm sure. A lot of these streetcar boats, the same people that ran streetcars ran them in the winter, and then they would come out here in the summer and be captains and crew, engineers and pursers on the, because it was similar work, you know, other than having to know something about marine technology and so on.
So what was your favorite piece as being the author of a book? This was your first book that you've authored.
Book.
And what was the process by which you got started, and what was your favorite part of it?
Well, you know, initially I decided just to put a text with some selected pictures, and then eventually I showed it to the Minnesota Historical Society Press, and to see if they'd be interested in perhaps publishing it. And they were, and so some 2 years later, I finally put it together, and I tried to do the graphics as well as the text. I didn't want to just give them a shoebox full of postcards and some words, and they were very helpful in the editing as well. They're very skillful over at the Historical Society, and I feel very fortunate to have them as a publisher because they've done a wonderful job, and not only the photography that's been used, but the materials, the pages and the cover, and it's been a really interesting project.
Well, you definitely it takes you back in time. The detail in the writing, even on the postcards in the book, you can read what people wrote, which gives you such a sense of history and of what was going on at that time.
Right, exactly. That's the part I like, is the backside. There's some other things too. For example, the way you affix the stamp. If you put the stamp on upside down, it often meant "I love you," or
really?
if you tipped it on sideways, it meant "I like you," or some other codes, and that would go back and forth between young couples.
And how did you discover that?
Well, there's a lot of information about postcards, because there's a lot of people that collect postcards, not just Minnetonka, but you know, almost every subject imaginable. And Now postcards are available on eBay, Minnetonka postcards, and now they've gotten quite expensive all of a sudden, and but they're still available, and periodically I'll pick one up. I think I got them all, and then I find another one, you know, that I haven't got it. There are about 300, at least that I have, and there are probably as many more that are more scarce, but it's such a thrill to find one. One of the things that before 1907, you could only write the address on the back of the card, and there was no place really for a message. But there was a slim little line at the bottom of the card or on the end of the card where you could write something. And one of the cards, and there's a picture of it in my book, that says something to the effect of, haven't heard from you in over a year. If dead, don't write.
The message is clear.
Yeah. So there's fascinating things like that, and I think we learn a lot from the back of the cards too. Little scraps of history or something we didn't know, you know, comes forward, and so it's fun to read them.
Well, you have definitely created not only a beautiful picture book and coffee table book. I actually gave it to my husband, or he got it from a friend.
Yeah.
But also such a sense of history and tradition that can be passed on. And whether you grew up in Lake Minnetonka area or you're a newcomer to the area, it has a lot to tell you and a lot to offer.
One of the things that I kind of personally like about it was when I was growing up, my parents we took both Time magazine and Life magazine. And as you know, Time was text or words, and Life was more pictures. And I always favored the Life one because you know, a picture, they say, is worth 1,000 words, and certainly was true with Life. And that's the good thing about this book, in the way, sometimes in the way that you can set it down and pick it up again next time you go by it, you know, and start afresh. You don't have to remember exactly where you were. So
I would agree. It's a great book that way. Well, just thank you for your giving a treasure to the Lake Minnetonka and the history and tradition. Let's take a little tour of the Minnehaha steamboat that you helped restore.
Good, and I'd like to show you around.
So Jim, you're the captain, or one of the captains of the Minnehaha. Take us on a little tour of of all the restoration that's happened. Let's start here with the smokestack.
Okay. Well, it's got a lot of interesting aspects to it, and it was a 6-year project by a lot of people, 180,000 man-hours. And this stack is, in order for us to get through the bridges of Minnetonka, in the old days they didn't have bridges, so we've engineered this stack so it telescopes down into itself. And so it's really a handy thing. We don't use it very often, but if we want to go to the upper lake or into Crystal Bay, we can get through the bridges.
Do that. And it didn't do that on the old...
It didn't do that on the old days, because they didn't really have bridges that they had to contend with like we do. They could pretty much go anywhere in the lake without a bridge.
This wood seating, you were telling me a little bit about all the ways the community came together to bring back and help restore.
They really did. The benches that we see up here, the wood is new, but the structure, the iron part of the bench, and they're really unique benches. There's 13 of them on the upper deck here, and they came back to us from various points. People had them on their patios or in their tennis courts, and they were so generous in bringing these things back. One by one, we got 13 of them back, just enough to put on the upper deck. We got the searchlight back. Searchlight is a bronze arc light that is wonderful to have. So many things. The anchor that's on the front deck was on the dock theater stage for maybe 40 years, and they gave us that back, so we have an original anchor. And other things throughout the boat came back. The engine is a very old engine. It's not the original, but it's almost identical. Came from a gentleman in California, gave it to us. And another generous company that owned a trucking fleet picked it up. It's a 6-ton engine, and they picked it up in California and brought it back. We restored it, put it in the boat.
That's amazing. And the chairs downstairs.
All the wicker seats downstairs are original, and they had quite a story to them. Some of the boats that were stripped of some of their equipment when they were sunk, dismantled, and particularly those benches, they went at auction, and somebody bought them and put them in a restaurant in Excelsior, And they eventually covered them with blue naugahyde, and they lasted for many years, but eventually they outgrew them, and they put them in the basement, and there they sat for 40 years and gave them back to us again. So we got a complete set of really original streetcar steamboat benches. We had them recovered, of course, with caning, and they came out perfect. They're the same kind of seats that are used in streetcars, and it's identical. A lot of the equipment, when these boats were manufactured, 6 of them, in the streetcar barns at 31st and Nicollet, next to the old Nicollet ballpark. And then they were brought out here on a flatbed train, and all were launched on in 6th of April 1906. So it was, there was a lot of things that we had to figure out because we didn't have an exact plan, but we had a blueprint.
And it took you 6 years to restore?
Took 6 years, and a lot of planking had to be replaced because of it was cypress wood, but still it deteriorated when the boat sat outside for so long. And so there was new hull planking, new decking, and new windows to be made. A lot of the ironwork, such as this part right here on the upper deck, is all original.
Really?
And it was just piled up in the middle of the boat, and when they recovered it. And so there was a lot of other things, I'm sure, that I'm overlooking that came back to us, different memorabilia.
And I have to ask, is there a horn?
There is a horn.
And is that an original?
It is a steam whistle, and it's right here.
Okay.
And it is an original, and the captain can operate it from up on the captain station where the steering wheel is. The steering wheel is an original one. Came out of the Como. And we've hidden a lot of the electronic equipment that's on board that's out of necessity for modern day navigation. We have a GPS, we have a rudder indicator, and a number of things, but they're hidden from view for the most part, and tried to conceal the things that weren't original.
Well, when you take a ride on the Minnehaha, you feel like you're on the original.
Well, you certainly do, and it's a fun boat to pilot too, I can tell you. It's very responsive, and it moves right along.
In your book, you also talk about another 100 or 150 steamboats.
Well, when I looked them all over, there were 150 different names, but actually about 100 actual steamboats, which is, I cross-referenced all of them in the glossary on the back of the book, and it's really interesting to see how they change names if a boat was sold or was rebuilt for any reason, if it was lengthened or heightened, or oftentimes its name was changed as well. And I also, another interesting thing I included in the book is the place names of various points on Lake Minnetonka.
That was very helpful.
And the bays, and how they got their names, you know, and where that name originated from. And so that's interesting. And the third thing, too, that's of interest is a timeline where a chronological order of things from the day that Minnetonka was first discovered until the boat was launched.
Picturing Lake Minnetonka, A Postcard History, is a book, Jim, that you should be proud of. And thank you for sharing the history and giving us a tour of the Minnehaha.
Well, you're welcome. I've been glad to be here today. It's a wonderful boat. Thank you very much.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.